California's water equation is quite simple. The demand for water from environmental, agricultural, and urban users is much greater than the supply of water. And it's a situation made more stark as California faces an historic drought. How do we get California's water numbers to balance now and in the future? We'll ask. Ellen Hanak, the director of the Water Policy Center and a senior fellow with the Public Policy Institute of California. The simple math of California water. Demand is greater than supply.
Additional funding for the Maddy report made possible by a grant from Paramount Agricultural Companies, growing healthy food for you and your family.
From the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Managing our water in California has never been more challenging. What are the basic facts and the most pressing water issues? Our guest is one of the state's leading authorities. Ellen Hanak is the director of the Water Policy Center and a senior fellow with the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome.
Thank you.
So let's start it simple. What are the major sources of water in California?
The two main sources are surface water and groundwater. Surface water is what we get from our snow and our rain, and groundwater is what ends up trickling into our groundwater basins. And on average, about 70% of the water we use is surface water and about 30% is groundwater, but when it's dry, like right now, it's probably more like 50-50.
Yeah. So what are the risks to our supply of water here in California?
So we have a variable climate, which means that the drought like we're experiencing now is a recurring feature of the climate. We have to prepare basically to know that average is not what we're going to get. We're going to get dry or wet typically. And then we also have some risks related to the warming climate. It's been record heat over the last couple of years, and what that does is it shrinks our snowpack. And the snowpack right now is a valuable place for storing our water that falls during the year.
And it's at record lows right now, the snowpack.
Record lows. It's 5% of normal.
Yeah. Other risk of the supply of water, isn't the groundwater pumping that's going on?
Well, so that's really a question of how do we manage that groundwater reserve. And during a drought, you do want to pump more. It's a good place to store water for droughts, but in some places, including in major areas of the San Joaquin Valley, we've been doing that. We've been relying too heavily on the groundwater basin, and so the groundwater table has been falling long-term over the last many decades.
And there's all kinds of issues, including sinking land that has to do with that subsidence.
Correct.
Let me go on to the demand for water. There seems to be three major areas of demand. The first, the largest actually, is environmental purposes. About 50% of water uses for environmental water use. First of all, can you explain environmental water use, and what impact does that have on other water uses, like for agriculture or for urban? So
the way the state does its water accounting, about half of the water on average looking over a long-term period is allocated to the environment, and then the rest for farms and cities. Well, what is counted as environmental water is often misunderstood, and really over half of that is up in the North Coast wild and scenic rivers. Those have been off limits to most human water uses since the 70s, when Ronald Reagan signed the legislation to make them wild and scenic rivers when he was governor.
So it's not, a lot of people think that environmental use could be used for ag and urban use, but really can't. That's a separate purpose.
That's correct. There is some environmental water also that's actually used to protect the quality of urban and ag uses. So there's some water that is sent out under the Golden Gate Bridge just to make sure that water in the Delta is not too salty. So that's environmental, but it's really environmental for people's uses. But there is also some water that is specifically allocated for in-stream flow to protect fish that are in trouble, and that's the part that people fight about.
Right. But like I said, a lot of this stuff is for the North Coast. But let me talk about the second largest user of water, and that's agriculture, about 40%. You often hear this 80% number, but that's ag uses 80% of human water use, so it's a little misleading. The actual use by agriculture is about 40%. Has that use increased over time?
It's really been pretty flat over time. If you look at the long-term trends, I don't think it's increased since the early 80s, actually. And in a dry year like now, the demand is actually higher, but there's not water available to provide that extra demand.
Okay, the third one is urban water use at about 10%. Has that increased over time? And what's the biggest user, by the way, of urban water use?
Well, so residential uses are the biggest. That's about 70% of all urban uses, and then the rest is for commercial uses and industry. Industry is actually pretty small in California now. And that was increasing over time until about the mid-90s. But since then, there's been a lot of effort on reducing per capita water use in cities. So even though population has grown, actual urban water use has remained flat.
The biggest use isn't landscaping the biggest use of urban water use?
Well, so about half of residential use is landscaping, and about half of commercial use is also landscaping. So on average, statewide, it's about half.
Okay. There's a lot of major water challenges, and they've really been exposed as a result of the drought. What kinds of challenges has the drought exposed in terms of our water use?
The biggest challenges are in the farming communities, because agriculture in California requires that you add water. We have dry growing seasons, and that's a very productive way to grow things if you can add your water, but when water's tight, it means that some land has had to be fallowed. Some rural communities in the San Joaquin Valley have also found that their groundwater pumps have gone dry, so that's a major challenge too.
And it's also, I think, focusing people on the whole issue of landscaping for urban use. People are now really thinking about, maybe I need to take my lawn out.
Correct.
Because of that use. Okay, well, I thank you for summarizing the basic water facts and most pressing issues. Up next, some more details on where California actually gets its water. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Where does our water come from, and what has to be done to ensure an adequate and reliable supply of water? Our guest is Hanak, the director of the Water Policy Center at the Public Policy Institute of California. You know, the Sacramento Delta is critical to the state's water supplies, supplying 25 million people water as well as 3 million acres of farmland. And the governor's got this $25 billion Bay Delta Conservation Plan that includes the addition of these two 30-mile tunnels under the Delta, and they're trying to achieve this co-equal goal of a more reliable supply of water while also protecting the Delta's ecosystem. What are your thoughts on this?
It's a really complicated system, and it has eluded solutions for a long time. There's been a lot of effort to try to find a workable project that's going to
Jerry Brown had this, and Jerry Brown 1.0 had this, right? Now it's,
correct.
It's back.
Correct. And so folks have really been working on this very intensively since the late 2000s, and very recently there's been discussion by the administration of shifting gears a little bit in terms of what regulatory approach to use, and instead of doing seeking a 50-year permit, they're now talking about staying with the current regulatory environment and seeking a less long-term permit, which might change the financing for the project.
You've also got all these levees in the Delta. There's something like, I think I read 1,100 miles of levees. What happens if we have an earthquake and they fail?
Well, this is one of the reasons why there's been an interest in building a tunnel or tunnels for water supply, because right now we pull water from the Sacramento River through these islands and through the channels to the pumps at the South Delta, and the islands are protected by these levees, many of which are fragile, and the islands themselves are like bowls with a lot of the land below sea level. So if you get an earthquake, the levees are susceptible, and if they fail, they'll pull a lot of salt water in from the bay, and that will mean that you can't pump water from the
25
pumps.
million people just lost their source of water.
And a lot of farmland as well.
Right, 3 million acres. And the other thing is the governor's plan are for pumps on the north side of the Delta and pump underneath the Delta and then connect to the south side. Let's talk about another supply of water, and that is storage. A lot of conversation on storage, both above ground and below ground. Let's assume, for sake of argument, that we can't solve this problem through conservation alone. So which is better?
That's a fair assumption, I'll
okay.
say. Yeah.
So what's more cost effective, to build more above ground or have more below ground storage?
So if you just do a strict measurement of dollars per amount of storage that you create, I think hands down you can say that it's cheaper to expand capacity to store water underground, because it just, you don't have to build as much. You just have to sort of build conveyance and some pumps to use the groundwater storage better. That said, you really need to think about storage as part of a system where you've got the surface reservoirs operating together with the groundwater basins, because surface reservoirs are more flexible. And so you can get water in and out of them more quickly. So
It's that conjunctive use term that we've heard.
Correctly. So what you ideally want to do is manage them together and ideally get more of the drought year storage in the reservoirs above ground into the below ground so that you can use them.
It's like a bank account, right?
It is exactly.
A water bank account. Okay, but another issue that's been talked about quite a bit is the contamination of groundwater. There was a UC Davis study that said that about 35% of the total population in the valley have nitrate contamination in their drinking water, and it's going to grow to 80% by 2050 if nothing's done to correct the problem. How costly is that cleanup going to be?
Right. So what you need to remember is that the solution is not in the near term to actually clean up the water that is already underground. The solution is to clean the water before it gets into your tap. So people that are living in large communities, Fresno, urban areas, they can afford the cost of removing the nitrate because there's sort of scale economies to that, and that can be done as part of regular water treatment. The real challenge is in the small rural communities that just can't afford that.
Yeah. The state has put some money aside for increasing the supply of water, the water bond, for example. What other actions are being taken by the state to increase the supply of water?
So there are a lot of things being done, and some of them more visible than others. I think one that a lot of places are building now is recycled wastewater treatment plants, kind of looking for, instead of just putting that water back into a river or into the ocean, looking to recapture that and reuse it.
Right, it's called the purple pipes, and they're using that to take care of parks and things like that.
Correct, and they're also starting to sell it to farmers in the valley. Mm-hmm. That's becoming an important source of agricultural water. I
want to ask you this. It's going to take billions of dollars to create this increased supply of water, but once you build these facilities, you're going to have to also maintain them. Where's the money going to come from to maintain these facilities?
So it's surprising to many people, but actually local water agencies raise a lot of funding. About 85% of the water funding that we have in California comes from local ratepayers, and overall, annually, we raise $30 billion for water. So the maintenance of these projects, I think people can handle it.
There's some money there. Well, I want to thank you for that overview of California water supplies. Up next, what are the various demands on the supply of water in California? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. When resources are plentiful, no one's concerned about who's getting what. The equation changes when those resources are scarce, and water is increasingly scarce in California. So what can be done to make sure there's enough water for everyone? Ellen Hanak is the director of the Water Policy Center and a senior fellow with the Public Policy Institute of California. So environmental water use accounts for about 50% of all water use in California. But 50% of that 50% is used on the North Coast and really can't be used for any other purposes. So what, if anything, can be done about that remaining 25% to make it maybe more efficient in its use?
So there is definitely room for getting more pop per drop from environmental water.
That's a great way to say it.
You know, what we can see is that with the amount of water that is allocated to the environment, our fish are still in trouble, and this is a big reason for conflicts in California water. So we need to get more efficient at it. There are folks, however, who look at certain river systems and think that we actually need to put more back into the water for the environment.
So just keeping it where it is probably as good as we're going to get?
That would be my guess over the long term.
Okay, well, let me talk about the second major user of water in California. That's agriculture, about 40%. They haven't been using a lot more water since the 1960s. In fact, they've become increasingly more efficient in their use of water, and ag's output per a unit of water is more than doubled since that time. But what can or should farmers be thinking about doing to ensure a sustainable agricultural economy given our supply of water?
So farmers have been making a lot of choices that have been, as you say, increasing the value of the water that they're using, and that includes technology, that includes cropping choices. The thing that they really are not doing yet that they need to do is manage their groundwater basins more sustainably so that they have enough water when it's dry, like right now.
Because they're really, when it's dry, like now, they're pumping quite a bit more, up to what, 50% of their water comes from groundwater sources?
In the Tulare Basin, it's probably much more than that, but and that's fine to pump more during a drought, but what you need to do is recharge those basins during the normal and wet years, and we haven't been very good at that in some ag areas.
Okay. Let's talk about the poor almond. It was getting some great press for a long time as, you know, one of the healthiest nuts you can eat, a very healthy food to eat. But recently it's been under attack. People are saying, and some say unfairly, that it takes a whole lot of water to produce one almond. Are water markets a solution to fairly determining who plants what and what gets planted?
So I am a firm believer in letting farmers make the business decisions on what crops to plant. And actually, almonds are a pretty good use of water. They generate a lot of revenue and profit per gallon of water used.
There's a reason why they're planting all those orchards.
There's a reason why they're planting all those orchards. There's strong demand for it, both in California, nationally, and even internationally. And California is a great place to grow almonds. So can markets help? Yeah. During a drought, markets can help get water to the farmers who have tree crops and who really need that water. And that's been happening, but probably not enough.
How would that work? How would a water market work?
Well, the way it works is that you have some farmers who have more senior water rights than others, and they're getting water even during the drought. So they might say, okay, what I'm doing on my farm is I'm not earning as much money with that. I'll fallow some of my land and send some of my water to folks, nearby or down the river where they really need it.
So it becomes a simple economic equation. I could plant crops and make this much money with the water, but I could sell the water and make this much money.
Right. And during a drought, it's really important to have that flexibility. And in the San Joaquin Valley, farmers use the market very intensively, actually. And
literally, no pun intended, the water would flow to its best use.
That's
correct.
That's
the idea behind a water market.
That's correct.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about urban use. Urban use has actually been falling. People are getting more efficient with their use of water, but still use about 10% of California water. What are some of the more efficient strategies, though, that state and local governments can use to reduce urban demand for water?
So, there's a lot of push right now for getting people to reduce their water use, especially since Governor Brown announced an executive order requiring statewide 25% per capita reduction. And in some parts of the state, that means even higher reductions. Those are places where people are using a lot more than the statewide average. The best way to conserve is to stop overwatering your lawn. A lot of people overwater. And then over the long term, changing out your landscaping so that ornamental lawns get replaced with other kinds of more drought-tolerant plants. It's a good idea.
And I think you start seeing people actually be incentivized to do that, either by the cost of water or by water districts even encouraging them with rebates.
Correct.
And that kind of thing. All right, well, thanks for that overview on the demand for water use in California, what can be done to make us use water more efficiently. Up next, what about California's water challenges? Are they being exacerbated by this historic drought? What can and should be done? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. California is in its fourth year of a severe drought. What can and should be done to manage the situation? Our guest is Ellen Hanak, the director of the Water Policy Center at the Public Policy Institute of California. So let's put the current drought in context. How common are these kinds of severe droughts in California? And how does this one compare to our past droughts?
So droughts are not new to California. It's a recurring feature of our climate. We have them every so often. We have a bad one like this every generation or so. The last big drought was really from the late 80s through the early 90s, and no single year was as bad, but just accumulated effects were pretty bad. This year, this drought has been record in the sense that it's been record heat combined with dry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it seems like it's a boom or bust, literally, when it comes to water in California. A lot of things in California, but including water. So how have the cities fared during this drought?
Cities have done surprisingly well, and that is because they made a lot of changes in their management after that drought I just mentioned from the late 80s through early 90s, including a lot of investments in local storage above and below ground, in conservation, and then storing that saved water, in diversifying their supplies, and in building interconnections between different local community systems.
But some smaller communities, some smaller cities, not so well, right?
Well, a couple of larger cities that are isolated from their neighbors and that did not have diverse supplies were in trouble, like Santa Cruz, or even Sacramento and Folsom in the Sacramento Valley, which is normally wet. And then a lot of small rural communities that depend on shallow wells have been in trouble.
All right. So how have farms fared?
Farms, are inevitably going to take a hit when there's a big drought because they need water for irrigation, and we have a large agricultural sector, and Farmers do their best to make up the lost surface supply with groundwater pumping, but they still had to fallow about 500,000 acres last year.
That's about 5% of their cropland.
That's right.
That was, though, for some of the lower value crops, but it's still 5% of the
Right.
cropland.
So the loss in revenues was not as big as the loss in water or in acreage, but still, they took a hit.
Right. What about the state's ecosystems? How have they been affected by the drought?
Not good. We already have very compromised fish species in California. In particular, we have a number of them that are listed under federal and state endangered species acts. And the winter run Chinook salmon, we lost basically the entire cohort of baby salmon, of the salmon eggs, because the water was just too hot.
Wow. So there are some implications for the drought on groundwater. What are they?
Well, because of the drought, I think we can say that really enabled the enactment of historic legislation called the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or affectionately known as SGMA. And that is going to enable local agencies to really get their groundwater basins under control.
They've got to create their own local sustainability plans under that, correct?
Correct.
And what was happening before with groundwater?
It was kind of a Wild West free-for-all in a lot of places, including in a lot of agricultural areas like the San Joaquin Valley and parts of the northern Central Valley.
And so they could just, if they could afford it, they could just keep drilling deeper and deeper.
Correct. And that becomes a problem once you get deep enough and you start to have shallower wells going dry and so on, and you get water quality problems, you get land sinking, you know, the whole range of factors.
This interesting subsidence is the land sinking issue. So can you give an example of how that might impact not just water issues, but land issues? When land starts to go down, then what happens to infrastructure and things like that?
So this is exactly why we have better groundwater management in our urban areas in California, because when the land started sinking, that meant streets and buildings were all jeopardized by the land sinking. In ag areas, it's less of a problem, but I've heard farmers talk about places where they used to be able to have level land that they could, you know, plant evenly on, and now
it's rolling.
Yeah, or they're having to pump because the incline has changed.
Well, so we've got this ongoing drought, but it sounds like droughts are going to be inevitable in California's future. So what needs to be done to address not just the current drought, but the inevitable future droughts we're going to be experiencing?
Well, what I like to say is that we need an all-of-the-above approach, and that means really looking at ways to diversify supplies, to improve our storage, especially get our groundwater basins under control, and then find ways to manage demand. And that includes not only conservation, but also improving our water markets so that you can get water from one place to another during a drought.
And all of that is kind of based on information, isn't it?
Correct.
So we're going to need a much better system of knowing exactly how much water we have, how much is being pumped. Things in the past, it sounds like, really weren't done.
We were getting away with having kind of slop in the system, and that's just not possible anymore.
Okay, well, I want to thank you for offering some solutions to both manage the current drought and future droughts. I want to thank our guest, Ellen Hanak, the Director of the Water Policy Center at the Public Policy Institute of California. If you want to stay current with state and local issues, you can sign up for our free e-newsletter, The Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Keppler for The Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.